So Star Trek Section 31 releases tomorrow on Paramount Plus, the first Star Trek film in 9 years, the 14th Star Trek film overall. And I thought it was kind of a perfect time to rank all of the Star Trek films because I rewatched all of the films from like late 2023 to early 2024 when I was doing my big Star Trek rewatch, and I was kind of doing it all in release order. So I got to rewatch them all, most of them for the first time in like 6, 7 years, which was really, really, really fun. And I'm just going to say from the get go, I've kind of a controversial Star Trek ranking. Like I've looked at other rankings online, and I'm like, yeah, mine is very different to that. So just bear that in mind. But I also want to just say that I don't dislike any of the Star Trek films. Like there isn't a single one out of the 13 that I'm like, oh, that's just a bad film. Like I think there's something to love or something to enjoy in all of them. But this is also coming from a Trekkie fan who, is gonna look for something to like about everything Star Trek, even when there might not be that much to like. So while for some people they're like, yeah, this film is absolute trash, the worst of the worst, I'm still like, well, it's got this in it, or it's got this in it. That doesn't make it completely trash to me, but you know, anyway, I think every Star Trek film is what I'm trying to say. I think every Star Trek film has at least somewhat of an enjoyable time. Now, there are two in particular that I do think are easily the worst of the lot, but even those I don't think are nearly as atrocious as people say. Anyway, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. There are Star Trek videos every single week, along with DC and Marvel, and sometimes I just talk about TV shows and movies I'm watching that I really like. If you're not new, then a like and a share always helps. It helps to kind of pump the numbers a little bit and to push the video out in front of YouTube's algorithm a little bit more and get it out there. So if you enjoyed the video, please do that. So anyway, let's start off ranking some Star Trek films. So in 13th place, I have my personal least favorite Star Trek film. It's Star Trek Interaction from 1998, and also called Star Trek 9, but I've never heard anybody call it that. Anyway, Star Trek Interaction, I don't know, to me is the only Star Trek film that, for the majority of its runtime, is just kind of boring. It really does feel like a mediocre two-part from The Next Generation just put onto the film. I still like the film. I think the back half of it can be pretty interesting sometimes. I don't know, I don't hate it, but I don't know. Why would they have thought that this would make a compelling Star Trek film? Like this is supposed to be in cinemas, go bigger, go bolder. Don't just do a pretty boring relocation storyline that then turns into protecting this alien race on their own planet that the Next Generation would have done a dozen times over its entire run. Like the films are supposed to do something more interesting, kind of do the things that Star Trek can't do on TV because you've got the budget now, you've got the film cameras, you've got a lot of this extra stuff that you wouldn't have access to on a traditional TV show. So I think for Star Trek and films, they need to make use of that and do something you wouldn't necessarily see on TV. And that to me isn't what Insurrection is. It also doesn't help that both in real life and in universe, this film happened during Deep Space Nine Season 7. Like it came out while Deep Space Nine Season 7 was airing, and it's timeline-wise, it's set during Deep Space Nine Season 7. So while Deep Space Nine is dealing with the most badass, insane storytelling that Star Trek has ever done, Insurrection comes out as a movie and says, oh yeah, while this big war is happening over there, Starfleet wants us and the Enterprise hanging out over here being diplomats or whatever because we're one of the only ships who can do that. Like, I don't know. Who greenlit that as an idea? I feel like, I don't want to be mean here, but when this is the kind of thing you say to yourself is deserving of a movie, it's hard to not understand why Star Trek movies started to bomb at the box office around this time. Because, I mean, after Insurrection, Nemesis came out, it did terribly, and Star Trek was dead in the films for a while. And I mean, when Insurrection is the kind of film you're putting out, it's not super hard to see why that happened. Okay, in 12th place, I have another one that people aren't going to be surprised to see this low. And to me, it is Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. And this film is kind of iconic just for the what does God need with a starship bullshit. And I don't know, The Final Frontier is a great name. I don't dislike this film, but I do think, similar to Insurrection, it's sort of boring for the first half hour or so until we get to Nimbus 3 and until Cybok gets on board the Enterprise. And I think once that starts happening, things get more fun, more fast-paced, more enjoyable as a whole. But at its core, I think The Final Frontier is just kind of a goofy film. Like, Voyage Home isn't necessarily goofy, but Voyage Home is funny in, like, a sincere and legitimate way. Whereas Final Frontier feels funny in the goofy way, where sometimes you kind of feel a bit bad because you feel like, am I laughing at the film instead of with the film? It is impressive, though, because Final Frontier, it kind of got to the point for the original series where you're like, okay, they're clearly running out of steam here. Maybe we need to start wrapping up these things and quit while we're ahead. But then Undiscovered Country came out after it and is fucking awesome. But Final Frontier, it's good on them that it took them 5 films in my opinion at least, to finally get to that point where it's like, okay, maybe we don't need to be getting an original series movie every 2 years or so. In 11th place, I have Star Trek The Motion Picture from 1979, the very first Star Trek film. I don't know. I have always had a little bit of a soft spot for the motion picture. I think it's a really visually beautiful film in a way that pretty much no other Star Trek film matches. There's something just very epic and huge and wonderful about this film. It is essentially 2001: A Space Odyssey. People have made that comparison forever. People have talked about that forever. That is just 2001 with a Star Trek paint job. And I think that's kind of what makes this one such an interesting watch, though, because it feels like a product of its time in a lot of ways. Like, this isn't a film I'd revisit often, but sometimes, yeah, epic music playing over long shots of ships flying through space is kind of maybe what you want to see sometimes, and this film has so much of that. I don't know, I just feel like this is a film that you would not get today. There's nothing that would ever come out like this today, because, I mean, a film like this would not do well today. People wouldn't go to see it. People probably wouldn't watch it. It seems like it's a very artsy, more indie sort of film where it's like, it's not what you would expect, but it's really interesting to watch and like get your head into what it was that led to this or what it was that made this. And I think if the first 6 original series Star Trek films were all like this, then yeah, that would be a problem. But because motion picture is the only one that's actually like this, it makes it stand out. It makes it for a different film. Now, I know I said it's a product of its time, but I do feel like the motion picture already sort of feels old by 1970 standards, because I mean, this is 2 years after Star Wars came out, and Star Wars sort of changed the game completely for science fiction space films. Star Wars just turned everything on its head and was like, this is what the future of science fiction is now. Whereas the motion picture feels like a film from the 1960s. Like, this motion picture came out 15 years after 2001: A Space Odyssey. It feels like it's film that is already old by the time it releases almost in 1980. So, I mean, that maybe goes against it. But again, it makes for a film where it's like, it's interesting to think about, it's interesting to talk about. And while, yeah, you might not want to rewatch it super often, and you're glad it's the only one, that makes it stand out more. In 10th place, I have Star Trek III: The Search for Spock from 1984, and this was the second movie in Star Trek's sort of trilogy that started with Wrath of Khan and ended with The Voyage Home, and the film has some really great stuff in it. Christopher Lloyd playing the Klingon Courage is a really cool casting choice. The destruction of the original Enterprise is an insane moment, and it's one of those epic moments that really only could have happened in a film. I know it's a refit version of the original, not the straight up original, but it's still a huge moment for Kirk and the gang where it's like, you've never seen something like this in Star Trek before. It never would have even occurred to you that they could destroy the Enterprise. And like, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about with Insurrection. Insurrection doesn't feel like it pushes forward the fact that this is a film. Insurrection just feels like an episode of the show. But Search for Spock feels like a movie because it's doing things that you just would never in a million years think you'd see in a TV show from the 1960s. And you do really feel the emotion as they're watching the Enterprise crashing into the atmosphere of the planet Genesis. Like, this is also the start, in my opinion, of the main crew of the Enterprise feeling like a legitimate family and less like co-workers, because that was kind of one of my issues with like the original series and the first few films. It doesn't necessarily feel like Kirk is friends with Spock and McCoy. Doesn't necessarily feel like Kirk is friends with like Uhura or Scotty or Chekhov or Sulu. But in this film, it does feel like that. It's starting to feel like these people really care about each other. They need to get Spock back. And it's great seeing them all go against Starfleet orders to get their friend back no matter what. I think it also just still, unfortunately, does feel like the weakest film in this trilogy, but it's still a very enjoyable film. In 9th place, I have Star Trek Generations, and similar to the motion picture, I've always kind of had a soft spot for Generations, because along with First Contact, these are the 2 first Star Trek films I remember seeing when I was growing up. Generations is a big deal, being the ultimate crossover by having Kirk meet Picard. You can argue that there are some missed opportunities by the film only including 3 of the original cast, and then only having Kirk be the one who continues past that, and only having Picard be the one that interacts with Kirk. But I think this situation is as best as it could be, because The Undiscovered Country was already a goodbye to the original series in most ways, and this movie was supposed to be the next generation's journey into the films, becoming the new movie crew, essentially. And I think you needed some kind of a crossover to make that transition work more. You definitely could have just had Generations be an entire Next Generation movie, but I think having Kirk come in to almost pass the torch, similar to how like McCoy was in the very first episode of Next Generation Encounter at Farpoint, to sort of pass the torch on to the Next Gen crew. I think it makes sense here that Kirk's here to pass the movie torch on to Picard and be like, okay, this is your story now, we're done. I think if you had Kirk be a part of the entire film, or if you had all the original series cast in the film, it would have overshadowed the Next Generation crew. Like, I remember reading about this kind of when I was going through my rewatch, and I think it was Ronald D. Moore who was like, one of the ideas was to have the movie be about the Next Generation cast versus the original series cast. That like the poster was going to be the Enterprise A versus the Enterprise D, and then Ronald D. Moore was like, there's no there's no reason for them to fight. Like, you would have to come up with a reason for them to fight that would feel a little cheap, that would feel like it's being forced, that, we can't just have these two crews fight each other. It can't be that. It needs to be something a little more subtle in terms of a crossover. And I think that was completely the right move, because it would have been weird to see Kirk on the bridge of the Enterprise A fighting Picard on the bridge of the Enterprise D. I think, well, it could have been really interesting, and sure, I would have liked to see it in like a What If or Elseworlds style Star Trek thing. I think if this was like a canon, proper prime timeline universe movie with just time travel shenanigans, I don't know how you would believably make that work. But just like Search for Spock, this film does something that a film should do, which is do the things this show could not do, and that is destroy the Enterprise D. But I also do love the visuals in this film, because we see that the Next Gen crew are in some of the newer updated Deep Space Nine uniforms. I actually think I read that like some of the cast in this are actually wearing the Deep Space Nine uniform. That maybe it was Jonathan Frakes as Riker was wearing Sisko's uniform from Deep Space Nine, like the actual like same uniform that Sisko would wear in Deep Space Nine, which is really cool. But I think that the film also has like this darker look to it, because a lot of the sets for the Enterprise D were built for a TV show, and they wouldn't be able to look as good on like a big film cinema screen. So they had to darken the sets and stuff like that, so that the film cameras wouldn't show a lot of the imperfections of a TV set, which is just, it's a lot of cool creative ways that end up making the film look visually more interesting, because we're not used to seeing like the Enterprise D bridge look this dark. I also love the final set of scenes with Picard and Riker on what's left of the Enterprise D bridge. There's like a very solemn feeling, but one that has like an undertone of hope behind it, kind of. In 8th place, I have Star Trek Nemesis from 2002, and I know most people consider this one of the worst Star Trek films, and I mean, objectively, it kind of is, because it pretty much straight up killed Star Trek in the movies to the point where the next film wasn't for 7 years, and when that film came out, it was a full-on reboot. I think Nemesis is kind of a special movie. It's not super well made, but I think it's super enjoyable. Tom Hardy playing Shinzon, who's a sort of clone of a younger Picard, is a crazy cool casting choice and a crazy cool decision. The actual battle stuff towards the end is some of the most exciting we've ever seen from the franchise, and makes for a very epic film. It's in this kind of weird place where Nemesis wasn't really supposed to be the final Next Generation film, because there was hope for a final film that then would have potentially crossed over with Deep Space Nine and Voyager, which that would have been awesome to see. But the box office and reception of Nemesis was so bad, as well as Enterprise on TV underperforming, that all the plans were changed and Star Trek pretty much died for a while. But despite this not being the final for Next Generation, I do think the film works well as one. We get a sense of things are very different. Riker and Troy are married now and are going off to the USS Titan. Data's dead and we're getting B4 instead. It does feel like there are major shakeups and changes in a way that no other Next Generation movie leaves us with. So it does kind of feel like we're saying goodbye to their era. But again, even if this wasn't the goodbye to the era, Picard Season 3 came out and pretty much gave us the goodbye to this era, which was really fun to see. In 7th place, I have Star Trek Beyond from 2016, and this is the first film on this list to be a part of JJ's reboot trilogy, the final film from that trilogy and the most recent film. We're still hearing a couple times a year about how they're trying to get a sequel of this off the ground, but it does feel very unlikely at this point, unfortunately. I hope we can still get it, because the best thing about these films is the cast and how they interact and all the dynamics between them, because that's very, very, very fun to watch. Beyond goes smaller scale than the prior two, and for sure feels like the most traditional Trek of the trilogy. Similar to Generations and Search for Spock, it does something like Destroy the Enterprise, which is, every time that happens, it's crazy to see, and we see the crew react to it in a really cool way. This was also Anton Yelchin's final film as Chekhov before he unfortunately passed away, as well as this being the first Star Trek movie since Leonard Nimoy passed, so this all adds an extra bit of kind of emotion to it. In 6th place, I have Star Trek IV The Voyage Home, and I said earlier on that Final Frontier is funny in that goofy, almost bad way. When Final Frontier is trying to be funny, sort of feels forced, but Voyage Home is almost a legitimate comedy in the best way possible. Like, it's a legitimately funny movie, and it's seeing the crew of the Enterprise in this fish out of water scenario where they're forced to blend in with what was at the time present day 1986, and it all works really, really well. Like, whether it's Chekhov and Uhura on the streets of San Francisco shouting about nuclear vessels, or it's Spock on a bus giving a Vulcan neck pinch to a guy with a boombox because he's being too loud, or Scotty trying to use a computer thinking it works like 23rd century computers, it's all really, really, really fun and really well done in a way we don't normally see Trek go to. Like, this almost feels like a live action version of Lower Decks, in the sense where Lower Decks isn't making fun of Star Trek situations, it's more so just like making fun of the absurdity that sometimes they find themselves in, and it makes things into a comedy. And I feel like that's what Voyage Home does. I also feel like this is kind of the easiest Trek film to introduce newer Trek fans to, just because it's set in San Francisco in the 80s, and it just sometimes feels like an 80s comedy with a Star Trek spin on it. In fifth place is Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, and I think this film is so good, like using the political landscape of real life at the time, incorporating the real life scenario of the Soviet Union collapsing, and paralleling that with the Klingon Empire being on the verge of situations of where they're going to collapse with the destruction of Praxis. And this is what Trek always does best. It's using real life situations, combining them with the sci-fi elements to create a film that, despite very much being steeped in like the 1980s and 1990s, still sort of feels timeless. This also serves as the final or the goodbye to the original cast. I think that they handled that all extremely well, because how many TV shows can say they were popular enough to span 6 whole films? Because if these films weren't popular enough or doing well enough, they wouldn't be making them. So that's crazy that a TV show from the 1960s was able to be popular enough to push this many films out, starring the exact same cast and the exact same characters. That's so impressive. In fourth place, I have 2009's Star Trek, the first of the J.J. Abrams trilogy, and this film means a lot to me because it was the first Star Trek film I was old enough to see in cinema. I was born the same year as Insurrection, was only 4 when Nemesis came out, so 2009 Star Trek was the first time I was like able to have this experience, this kind of thing where I just remember being hyped and excited for a new film. I think this was the first time in my life I actually remember needing to see a brand new film and being excited for one. The Christmas after this film, I got all of the action figures of the cast. I got the transporter set. I got the bridge set. I got this like Enterprise thing, model toy thing, where you could press the button and it would turn on and make warp sounds. I still have it, but like the nacelles all falling off and it's broken, but it's somewhere. But I think this film just really put Star Trek in the public consciousness for a while in a way that it hadn't been for a long time. It made Star Trek a known thing for a lot of people, especially around my age at the time too, because I remember this was the first time I was able to actually talk to people in school about Star Trek because they were also seeing the new film. And yeah, it's an action film predominantly. It sometimes feels like it's J.J. Abrams wanting to make a Star Wars film and using Star Trek to do that. But I think it's just an extremely accessible film because it's just a good film. It's just a really enjoyable, well-made, well-cast, well-acted film where everything in it feels like it's got a huge budget, feels like it's made for the big screen. And I think it makes it an impressive film that Star Trek was able to do that or be that for a while, because it's not traditionally what you would think of Star Trek as. And I think this film appeals to everyone. Whether or not Star Trek fans want to admit it or not, that was important to expand Star Trek past the usual fan base in order to keep it alive. Because without these films, who is to really say if Star Trek would have kept up the momentum to get back to TV in 2017 and 2018 and lead us to where we are today? In third place, I have the only other Star Trek JJ trilogy film, and that is 2012's Star Trek Into Darkness. I know a lot of fans have serious issues with this film, the depiction of the Klingons, the depiction of Khan, the depiction of other things, but similar to 2009 Star Trek, this film meant a lot to me because I was able to see a Trek film in cinemas, which was not a common thing for me. And this was the first time I remember seeing a film in cinemas and then going, I need to see that again. And then I actually saw it twice. It was the first film ever that I saw twice in cinemas because it was that good to me. I think this one somehow eclipses the first film because it takes everything from the first film and it makes it bigger and better and more epic. And I mean, look at that poster. Look at that poster. It's so good. It's one of the coolest film posters that I think I've ever seen in my life. But this is like the first one where, yeah, it maybe doesn't feel like a traditional Trek experience, but it's just a great film and a great cinema experience. I think it just constantly is ramping up the stakes and the tension throughout the entire thing. You're almost holding your breath for the last hour because you're like, how can they top whatever they just did? And every time they do. And I don't know, I might get some hate for putting it this high, but I just think Into Darkness is just such a great and enjoyable time. In second place, I have 1996's Star Trek First Contact, and the Borg were always my favorite Star Trek villains growing up, which is why I think I have this one here. The Borg Queen is super scary, her connection to Picard and Data make this feel like more of a personal film. Seeing the new Enterprise E makes for a great time, the battle against the Borg cube at the beginning, and bringing in the Defiant from Deep Space Nine to kind of have the Defiant do what it was always meant to do, which is fight the Borg, kind of makes this really cool little crossover moment too. And getting to actually see First Contact and Zephyr Cochrane and the Phoenix, all this huge Star Trek lore stuff that has been teased since the original series came out. I also think it just makes this for a very special film where it feels like you're finally seeing this stuff that Star Trek fans were probably at the time really wanting to see and really waiting to see. I just think I've got a lot of nostalgia for this one just because it's definitely some of my earliest Star Trek memories. Also, maybe hot take, but I think Patrick Stewart is his best as Jean-Luc Picard in this film. Like, I think he eclipses everything else as Jean-Luc Picard he's done in First Contact. Like, you get this real raw emotion about him, and the sense that he's a bit rattled, he's a bit scared in a way that you're not usually used to seeing Picard as. Like, he's not about to let the Borg do to anybody again what they did to him, and it's personal, and he wants to just tear them down and take them down, and it makes for an epic time. And in first place, and was there really any doubt, I have 1982's Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And after the motion picture, it felt like an outdated film in a way. They took the feedback on board and made a film that immediately told you this was a different kind of beast and a different kind of Trek than you've ever seen before. There's a reason why this is the one Star Trek film that you'll often see on like the best films of all time lists, because it is. The Enterprise versus the Reliant in the Mutara Nebula, seeing how Kirk tries to outsmart Khan. I think Wrath of Khan really does a lot of this stuff well. It having this real old school World War II fight where it feels like U-boats battling it out. I think Wrath of Khan does a good argument for what makes Star Trek different than Star Wars when it comes to like the space battle department. Because with Star Wars, you've got the X-Wings and the TIE fighters feeling like a very sort of dogfight, World War II style fight. I think it's because George Lucas was a big fan of that sort of stuff. And then Wrath of Khan instead goes at the angle of, these are big ships in a nebula that feels like they're underwater, where they're trying to outsmart each other, where they're trying to get hits on each other before the other one can hit back and stuff like that. It's like, I don't know, Star Wars feels like Dunkirk in a little bit of in some ways, whereas Wrath of Khan feels like Das Boot, which both fantastic World War II films. Big fan of both of them. I could rewatch both of them endlessly, but both of them are two extremely different things, and how the two of them handle tension and stakes is extremely different. And I think Wrath of Khan is Das Boot, Star Wars is more Dunkirk. Both great, both do what they want to do extremely well, and it's all great stuff. Anyway, that's my ranking of all 13 Star Trek films. Is my ranking bad? Is it good? Would your ranking be different? Would your ranking be the same? Let me know. And again, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. That's always a huge help. If you're not new, a like and a share always goes a long way to helping YouTube, push this video out, and maybe people can see it. Maybe they won't. Who knows? Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and have an amazing day.